This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm speaking with Linden Groves of the Gardens Trust about the vital and surprisingly vulnerable protections for our historic parks and gardens, and the government's proposal to remove the Trust's statutory consultee role. We unpack what this would mean for our green spaces, why it matters to all of us, and how people can help.
One of our predecessor organisations, the Garden History Society, was started up in the 1960s by a bunch of historians. I gather they were kind of thought of as hippie historians when you compare them to building historians and that kind of thing, around their kitchen table. In fact, one of our founders was Mavis Beatty, who was one of the Bletchley Park code breakers. So we like to think, they were a determined, smart bunch of people trying to help out best we can. So they kind of started the whole movement of thinking about parks and gardens and how important they are, but also just how historic they are. And then the subject and the organisation grew over many decades. And like I say, then County Gardens Trust started to be created all across the country with MOGs or grassroots volunteers. But the principles are still the same kind of ones. It's about researching, championing, raising awareness, and also conservation as best we can. And that's still largely what we do. We just do it in different ways. So research, on one level, we've got our international academic journal of garden history, but also we do loads of work with volunteers, training new volunteers to research and record parks and gardens in the way that suits them best, but also in ways where maybe that research can then have a practical application in helping to protect those parks and gardens for the future. We do a lot of events, particularly since COVID. We do a lot of online events, which are really popular and go out all across the world. So I would love it if your listeners would, like to take a look at our website and see what kind of stuff there is for them to get involved in. We do a lot of raising awareness, be that amongst, movers and shakers in other organisations or, everyday people on the street. It's all about helping everybody to understand that historic parks and gardens might sound like a niche, but actually it's really not. These are kind of the public parks that you maybe visit, every day, walking through it on the way to work, or maybe the beautiful gardens that you like to visit with your mum on a Sunday afternoon. They're really a part of everybody's lives, whether we realise it or not. And one of the big things that we do around conservation is that we're a statutory consultee in the planning system. So that was a role that was created 30 years ago as a big step forward as the way to help make sure that parks and gardens survive for future generations. So if you think about listed buildings or ancient monuments, for example, they have their own what's called consent regime in the planning system. So listed building consent, for example, there's hundreds of thousands of listed buildings with that consent regime, where if you want to do certain types of works to listed buildings, you've got to get consent from the local planning authority, whereas there is no consent regime for parks and gardens. But what our predecessors managed to set up 30 years ago instead was us being a statutory consultee in the planning system. And that basically means that if a local planning authority receives a planning application that may affect a registered park or garden, it needs to consult us, and we give advice on what the impact of that might be, how the positives can be as good as possible, and how the negatives can be mitigated. So just registered parks and gardens as a term, it's a park and garden equivalent of listed buildings. So there's only 1,700 odd of them in the whole of England. So they're really, really rare. Partly because they've only been added to the list for the past 30 years, whereas listed buildings are much older. They've been recognised for a lot longer. So we're consulted on any planning application that might affect a registered park or garden, and we're able to tell the local authority about that park or garden and what we think the impact of the planning application might be, which will help them to make a decision on whether they're giving planning permission or whether they're giving planning permission with certain conditions. So I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about, if that's okay with you, is the government's shock announcement that they're considering removing us as a statutory consultee in the planning system, and what that would mean for parks and gardens.
Yeah, very happy to talk about that. I might just kind of take a step back though, because who would register a park or garden?
So Historic England makes the decision. So anybody, any member of public or, an expert, an interested person, an owner can submit information to Historic England via their website on why they think a particular park or garden should be registered. The terms are that it has to be 30 years old or more than 30 years old. And if you look at the Historic England website, it's got various other criteria that it needs to fulfil. So it needs to be of a certain level of what they call special historic interest. So you can submit it, anyone can submit it via the Historic England website, and they then have a team of experts who match it against various criteria and decide whether or not it's going to be registered. And that's the main tool with which parks and gardens are protected, I would say.
And does it have to be publicly owned or publicly accessible?
No, not at all. I mean, personally, the ones I'm most interested in are the ones that people can visit easily, but it could be completely privately owned. It could be something that's never open to the public, or it could be the public park at the end of your street. So registered sites are very much like listed buildings, are split into 3 tiers. So there's grade 1, which are the super special ones. There's grade 2 star, which are very special, and there's grade 2, which are really, really important. Grade 2 sites make up about 65% of the registered sites, and we're the only statutory consultee for grade 2 sites, which could be a Victorian public park that people visit all the time. It could be a cemetery, it could be a seaside garden, it could be a 1980s industrial landscape, or for example, Buckingham Palace Gardens are registered at grade 2. So there's all different kinds of sites on there.
I mean, it's interesting to think that they don't currently have the protections that we might assume they do. So they could even be attached to a historic building, but the garden itself wouldn't necessarily be protected or its significance registered anywhere. But if it contains, for example, a historic building in it or piece of statuary or an old tree, then those kind of things could be listed, but the garden itself wouldn't be. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, it's quite possible that there could be a really fabulous 18th century garden that hasn't made it onto the register just because the register is only 30 years old. And to be honest, as a sector, we haven't caught up with adding everything that should be added. But the garden wall could be listed, for example. So the wall could actually be more protected than the rest of the garden.
To me, it seems quite shocking, really, that they don't have more protection in place. So I was going to touch on a little tiny bit as well on your funding, because that is quite often of interest to people, just to sort of know what keeps you going.
Yeah. So, we're a small charity with what we see as a really important, massive role, which is to champion and protect parks and gardens that people don't understand just how vulnerable they are, just how little other protection there is. So, we're always sort of scraping around for money, to be blunt. So we get a small grant from the government for our statutory consultee role, and I can give you some details of that later. But also we have membership fees are absolutely vital to support what we do. Donations, of course, running the online events brings in some income. We're always looking for sponsors, that kind of thing. But, like any small charity, it's just kind of scraping together what we need on a year-by-year basis to keep delivering this role. But I'm kind of making us sound, I guess, very small and insignificant in the big picture of things. But just to break down the funding situation and the government's proposal, we get annually what is currently about £43,000 a year from the government to do our role as a statutory consultee. We subsidise that massively, gathering money in the ways I kind of described to you. But we worked out, following the government's proposal to remove our work, what it would cost local planning authorities to fill the gap that we would leave behind if we weren't able to give them advice and they had to hire and train staff to provide that advice for themselves directly. It would be almost £4 million a year.
Wow.
So the saving we're making for taxpayers is absolutely massive. And I don't think anyone would say, well, local planning authorities should just not protect parks and gardens or should just make it up as they go along. That's not allowed in the planning system anyway, but I think, as a nation, we wouldn't want that to happen. One of the things that's really kind of moved and shocked me over the past year since the government started this discussion was the number of people who've said to me, with the best will in the world, yes, but that would never happen. A park or garden wouldn't get built on, or wouldn't have a multi-storey car park built right next to it, blocking all the light, that kind of thing. That would never happen, would it? Because they're protected. And I have to say, well, no, they're not as protected as you think they are, because they're such your listeners will know this. So, excuse me for preaching to the converted, but because our nation's culture is so centred around parks and gardens and gardening, whether we realise it or not, even if you don't yourself like gardening or you don't think you like gardens, definitely parks will be a massive, massive part of your kind of social identity. And it's been that way for so long now that we just assume that there have always been parks and gardens, and there will always be, and they're in some way magically protected. But that just is not the case. So we're really worried by what the government's proposing. It's not just, it's annoying for our organisation. It actually could have a massive impact on everybody.
I don't assume that, because successive governments have been continually, as far as I'm concerned, riding roughshod over everybody and our green spaces. However, that aside, what exactly is the government proposing?
What they're proposing is really complicated. I know the subject inside out, and I have to squint quite hard to follow what the proposal is. And to be blunt, partly that's because it actually doesn't really make sense. It's genuinely a really bad idea. But essentially what they're proposing is that we wouldn't be consulted on planning application, we'd be notified. And that sounds like a really small difference, but it's actually massive, because you've got to go back to thinking about how there's no protection regime for parks and gardens other than us being a statutory consultee. And in the sort of small print, so to speak, being notified is a very different kettle of fish. And I won't go into all that detail because it's quite tedious. But the really worrying thing is that because Historic England would still be able to do 1 and 2 star, no one would be consulted on grade 2. And if you remember, I was saying that's 65% of the parks and gardens that we've just been discussing are grade 2. They would just kind of be left to fend for themselves. And most worryingly, what the government's proposing is that we wouldn't even be notified of planning applications that aren't within the boundaries of the park or garden. They're just outside. And that's a concept called setting, which some of your listeners will be, aware of the term, but you'll all know what the actual concept is if I explain. So if you think about going to your local park, there's the boundary that is actually the park. So we would still be notified of planning applications to works within that boundary. So, a new cafe, a new litter bin, new signs, new gates, that kind of thing. To be honest, those kind of planning applications, more often than not, are, kind of okay, because they're normally put in by the people who are looking after the sites. So, often they're kind of okay. But the really worrying stuff will happen just outside the boundary, where if you think about your local public park, you're relatively unlikely to be spending the whole afternoon staring at the Victorian fountain in the middle of the park thinking, what a beautiful fountain. Probably what you're enjoying is kind of being able to see a big open sky, being able to see, trees where you can't see the city beyond. So you're kind of feeling like you've got a really direct connection with nature. Probably you're enjoying the kind of peace and quiet. And currently, because we're consulted on planning applications that affect a park or garden, it scoops up all of that work that could happen just outside the boundary. So we're able to comment on that and say, hey, that tower block is maybe a bit too tall to be this close to the park. Could you make it a bit lower or angle it, or, have the different levels staggered or something like that, so there's less of an impact. Whereas we wouldn't be able to find out about those applications in future. So, you could see big, multi-storey office blocks, for example, looming the whole way around your favourite public park and really blocking out all of those views and things like that you've enjoyed. And thinking about famous English gardens, for example, in the countryside, the way they've been designed, most of them, I would say, over hundreds of years, part of the art is taking into account the views. So famous designers, Kit Brown, William Kent, for example, designing those gardens so that they brought in a view of a hillside opposite, or a church opposite, or, beautiful river. That's also setting. So currently we've always been able to sort of say, hey, watch out, this big car park that you've put here actually is going to be massively visible in the really important world famous view of the river from this incredibly famous and beautiful garden that was designed specifically 300 years ago. Whereas with the government's proposals, we won't find out about those applications, let alone be able to offer advice. And realistically, local planning authorities will want to do the right thing in those planning applications, because we're talking about gardens that people travel, thousands of miles from across the world in order to be able to see and enjoy. To say nothing of everyone who lives in this country and just pops along on a Sunday with their granny or whatever. So local planning companies don't have that expertise. So there's a very, very real danger that they'll be making some really unfortunate, regrettable decisions where 30, 40, 50, 5 years time, to be honest, people will be visiting those same gardens and thinking, this would have been such a lovely view if only there wasn't a car park in it. Why can't the car park be a bit to the side, for example, or have some trees in front of it? And currently we're the organisation who would be making that suggestion, move it to the side, put some trees in front of it, think about a different location. But we won't be able to do that anymore with the government's proposal.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make there, is that it's not that you just flat out say no to things because it might spoil something that's been there for like 100 years, or it might spoil some amenity value. But you're saying you might be able to do that, but have you considered doing it in this way that has the less impact? So I think that's good to clarify. And also thinking more historically, have you had planning decisions where you fed into them and they have adapted them as a result? And it doesn't necessarily, like I say, mean to say you can't do it, but it's just do it, but in this sympathetic way. Do your thoughts quite often get taken on board?
Yeah, so, as statutory consultee, and in any case, just as a sensible, pragmatic organisation, we have no interest in just saying no to things just because they're different from what has come before. And we're also really conscious that these parks and gardens aren't special because they're old. They have been able to become old because they're special, and so people wanted to take care of them. So our role, as we see it, is to support development, to support growth, but make sure that it's positive development. So just thinking about the most obvious example, and excuse me, it's a bit kind of crass, but we want to see, we're fully supportive of the government's move to build 1.5 million homes. Wouldn't that be fantastic? We all want to resolve the housing crisis. But what we don't want to see is a kind of repeat of the Victorians, where they built so much so fast without understanding about community well-being that you end up with Victorian slums. And we're really concerned that in its sort of haste to build these homes, the government actually throws the baby out of the bathwater, and we end up with homes that don't have good quality, mature, fantastically designed green space around them. But that's all there, it's ready to go. We just need local planning authorities to understand what they have so they can make the most of it for future generations.
So what is their motivation? And as you say, throwing the baby out the bathwater, is it just to get these homes built more quickly? Is it to kind of expedite that process?
Yeah, I think it's about, the government said over and over again, haven't they, 1.5 million homes, and that's fantastic aim. And then as they see, part of achieving that is streamlining the planning system, which is very complicated. But it's complicated for a reason, and that's to, achieve the job that it's set out to do of making sure we have high quality development. It's massively, massively underfunded and under-resourced, and that is a problem. I think the government has kind of acted in haste. Back in the spring, they kind of announced they wanted to remove us without having spoken to us about it at all. So they didn't understand what we do or how parks and gardens are protected, how important they are, how they fit into the planning system. And it feels like since then we've tried so hard to speak to them, to show them what the real situation is and to suggest alternatives. But I think they're just kind of set on this track, and really what we want to do is just kind of, let's pause, let's discuss this. We are sure they don't want to harm parks and gardens, but what they're proposing unintentionally is going to do that.
Funnily enough, I've just recorded an interview with somebody, and we've been talking about universal principles of design in a green space that makes it attractive and beneficial, in a proven way to humans. And it just seems to run very counter to what a Labour government would be in favour of. You know, why would you take away the things that are actually proven to be good for people, or why would you denigrate those spaces? It doesn't make sense to me on a political level. And I mean, you may not want to get into the weeds of that, but it certainly doesn't seem like a very common sense decision for a Labour government.
No, I mean, I don't want to get political, and, I always like to assume the best. So, when I'm feeling cheery, I just think this is all some terrible misunderstanding. I'd like to think they just don't understand the impact of what they're proposing, and we really need the government to just pause, listen to what we're saying, think about it more carefully. And there are so many alternatives. And of course, fundamentally, we are a small charity. Removing our role from the planning system is not going to suddenly make 1.5 million homes be built. It's not going to have any significant impact on streamlining the planning system. But what it is going to do immediately is leave local planning authorities in a desperate situation, having to make planning decisions without any advice to base those decisions on.
Yes, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. I'm lost for words, really. I'm trying to get my head around it, because as you say, what's the alternative? Then presumably you're paying privately employed consultants, or are you just getting rid of that process altogether?
Yeah. So the local authorities have conservation officers whose role it is to, advise and look after the historic environment. There are notoriously very, very few of those now. They've had massive, massive cuts over the past 5-10 years. And conservation officers would all say, even those of them that still exist, they have building expertise and archaeology expertise, but they just don't know about historic parks and gardens. So local planning authorities, without us, in order to deliver their role, would need to recruit new staff. But these people, there aren't hundreds of historic park and garden specialists just sitting out there wishing a local authority would create a job for them. They don't actually exist. So I guess potentially there's a huge gap whilst somehow a massive, massive recruitment and training campaign goes on. All local authorities will have to turn in the short term to consultants to do that work in place of staff. I can't honestly remember the figure of how much it will cost local authorities to use consultants for that work, because it's so massive. I don't share it very often because it sounds like I'm making it up, but you can imagine it's absolutely huge. It's many, many millions of pounds compared to the grant we get, which is £44,000 a year.
And is it possible they just won't do that at all? I don't really understand the planning system in any way, really, a lot of the time. But yeah, will they actually just scrap that part of it, do you think? Or will they have to include an assessment that looks at the parks or gardens?
So as the planning system currently stands, local planning authorities do have to kind of take care that what they're putting through isn't going to damage historic parks and gardens. So they do have some responsibility at the moment to watch out for them. They just won't have the tools to enable that to happen.
Yeah, I just wondered if it might be a slippery slope, if that, get rid of the experts and then get rid of the whole process altogether. But
yeah.
Yeah,
I refuse to believe that the government actually consciously decided what they want to do is damage parks and gardens. But then sometimes they do wake up in the middle of the night and think, gosh, is this a slippery slope? And the next step will be to tell planning authorities not to worry about it. Let's hope not.
Yeah, let's hope not. But it's not a total impossibility. So is there a future for the charity beyond this? If you are removed as part of that process, will you still continue to do other work?
Yeah, so I'm not going to lie. When the government made their announcement completely out of the blue to us in March that this is what they were proposing, it was a massive slap in the face to us and also our volunteers. So our consultee role, we deliver that. We have a very small staff team, but we also work closely with volunteers in the County Gardens Trust. And to have worked so hard for so long and then be told very, very publicly, it was announced in the House of Commons, that we are blockers to development, was a massive shock. But we've picked ourselves up. We're determined to carry on one way or another. The job will be much, much harder without this role in the planning system. One way or another, we must conserve parks and gardens. We're just not sure, in future how we will do it. If your listeners would like to help, I would be so grateful. It feels a real kind of, all hands to the pump moment to us, to be honest. So the most immediate thing is the government consultation on removing us as a consultee is now live. It's live until the 13th of January. There's a link to it on our website. It's a big, intimidating, complicated consultation, I'm not going to lie, but there are a couple of questions specifically relating to us. It doesn't matter how smart or expert your response is. If you're just someone who cares but doesn't feel they fully understand all the ins and outs of the planning system, that's absolutely fine. We just need people to do the response, say that they support us, a little bit on why, just to show the government that this isn't a niche subject and people do care. That would be a huge help. And then obviously we're a membership organisation. We really rely on our members to keep us going, financially, apart from anything else, but also in terms of our morale. So joining the Gardens Trust would be fantastic, or perhaps joining local county gardens trusts. And we've got loads of volunteering opportunities as well. So there's a whole range of ways to help. And I would just say the thing that has kept us going since March is the support has been absolutely unbelievable. Support from everyone, apart from the government, unfortunately, has just been mind-blowing. So I really am so grateful to anyone who can help.
Thank you to Linden. And if you care about protecting our parks and gardens, please do consider taking action to support the Gardens Trust and petition the government. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 336, Creating an Ark, and episode 351, Wild Campuses, Wild Futures. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.